Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another Dean's Talk. I am pleased and privileged to welcome Penny Green, Dean of Queen Mary University's School of Law. Penny made the way from London to Graz only on Sunday, and I'm thrilled that she's with us today. Penny is, among other things, not only an administrator, but a wonderful scholar. She has more or less single-handedly, at least or so I understood it, shaped the theory and scholarship on state crime, and that is what we will focus in our Dean's Talk today. Penny generously gave us an hour of her time to learn more about her scholarship and about state crime in general. So Penny, thanks so much for being with us. It is great to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph. And I should say it wasn't me single-handedly. I did have some wonderful colleagues who assisted with the development of state crime. But yes, that's what my name is associated with. And I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I think your town and university is really beautiful. So you're very fortunate, I'd say.
Oh yes, we are indeed. But particularly fortunate to have you, of course, and your humility, of course, speaks for itself. So, as a general idea for the audience, and for me in particular, how can states commit crimes, actually?
Well, I think states can commit crimes in a really wide variety of ways. I mean, we focused in particular on state violence and state corruption. So I think, largely state crimes fall into those two camps: economic crimes and crimes against groups or individuals. I think what's really important to understand about our conception of state crime is that it's not a legalistic one. We don't use an international law definition of state crime. We use one that we developed criminologically, I suppose. And our understanding of state crime is human rights violations perpetrated by state agents, but very importantly, in the pursuit of state organisational goals. So it's a state crime if it advances particular specified interests and goals of a particular government or a particular state. Rather than, during war, for example, you'll hear about war crimes, individual soldiers committing rape or individual acts of violence against enemy combatants. And that might be a state crime, but it might be part of a strategy. For instance, as rape in war has been used as a strategic device to control an enemy. But it might be simply an individual act on the part of that individual soldier. So it's very important to think about what is at stake for the state involved and why are they committing crimes. And they very often engage in these kinds of crimes, particularly say against the environment, in collaboration with corporations. So there's a mutual, if you like, interest in committing particular crimes. So that's the definition, and we adopted this definition because we know that states make laws and that they're notoriously unwilling to define their own behaviour as criminal. And I think one of the things that we've learned in terms of the research that my team and I in particular have conducted over many years is that one of the ways we really learn about state criminality is not through the institutions of criminal justice or international law. We find out about state criminality through small civil society organisations, NGOs, victims groups. They are absolutely critical to our understanding of state criminality. So I think for me, civil society is an absolutely critical conceptual tool for understanding crimes committed by governments and actually corporations as well. Crimes of the powerful more generally.
And so, I'm wondering, you said your conception is not a legalistic one. Who says what is criminal in the first place? And what makes a state crime a crime in particular?
So I think crime is a very significant label. It's a powerful label. to describe actions which people, whilst they might have great difficulty with, nonetheless accepted as part of governance, part of the way states operate. But actually, when you can use the label criminal to define the activities and actions of a state, it's a very powerful symbolic tool. Now, how do we decide what is criminal in terms of a state? I mean, and I think civil society plays a really important role here. One of the reasons we know about many state crimes or many sort of human rights violations is because small groups recognise that what is happening to them is illegitimate. It might be illegal. Very often it is illegal, but it's specifically illegitimate from their perspective. And if a state is performing these acts, then it is breaching certain codes and certain expectations and certain regulations it expects the rest of the population to abide by. So when states deviate from the rules and regulations which they expect us to conform to, then that's a way of starting to understand the behaviour as deviant, perhaps, or illegitimate. And depending on the nature, if there's a human rights violation involved, if it's advancing a particular state organisational goal, if it's perpetrated by state agents, then there's a very strong argument that it's a state crime. And so it's about very much relying, I think, on the voices of civil society, the voices of activists. One of the big projects that I was involved in was to look at resistance to state violence and corruption. So the first book on state crime that I wrote was really about state crime and thinking about the kinds of crimes that we can typically associate with states, like torture, genocide, state corporate offending, police crime, and so on. And when we started to sort of think about it more closely, we realised that really we know about these events, not, as I said, through courts or through lawyers or through criminal justice professionals. We learn about these offences, these violations, these illegitimate acts through people on the ground, people who are experiencing the violence or the corruption, people who are organising as advocates for those who are victims of violence and corruption. So I think that understanding civil society as central to our conception is critical, and listening to the voices of civil society is the place in which we learn a tremendous amount about state crime. And we were interested, I suppose, in this project. I mean, the project on resistance was looking at, in effect, the dialectic between resistance and repression and resistance, the way in which repressive states, dictatorships, authoritarian societies, and to some extent democratic societies, the way in which they suppress the actions of those who are resisting the said state violence and corrupt practices. And we realised that we came to know about state crime primarily as a result of these actions, and understanding that dynamic, that dialectic, if you like, was really fascinating. And it was a dialectic in that state repressive practices changed to accommodate the kind of resistance that was being afforded, that was being, turned against the state, if you like. And so, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about a range of things, but the countries that we looked at were Colombia, Kenya, Turkey, Tunisia, Papua New Guinea, and Myanmar. So they were a range of state formations. Some were authoritarian, very explicitly authoritarian, in the periods that we were looking at. So Tunisia we looked at in the period when Ben Ali was in power, when it was effectively a police state. Countries like Turkey were, if you like, fragile democracies. They were democratic in form, but there were significant issues with the democratic process. countries like Myanmar had come out of very severe dictatorship, transitioning to a form of democracy. Of course, with Myanmar, it's completely reverted with the coup of 2021. So we were looking at different state formations and looking at the way in which the kinds of crimes that those states committed against their citizens and people who lived there, not only their citizens, but those who lived there. And we wanted to understand, this process of what does civil society do? Because what we found is whenever you have state repression, there will be forms and pockets of resistance. It is the nature of human beings to resist violence and corruption and the kind of violations that we're interested in. But it's very, very difficult when you live in a hugely repressive under a hugely repressive dictatorship. And much of what we studied operated underground, in secret. So we learned some fascinating things about the way in which people did that. And then there were less dramatic examples in more democratic countries, but nonetheless, through different forms of protest against particular acts of violence or suppression or corruption. You had civil society organisations operating in quite different ways and managing their states, if you like, managing the nature of the repression that was taking place. So that was key. And then, that led, of course, into the work I've done on genocide, in particular in Myanmar, and that's been occupying me for the last 10 years primarily.
We'll come back to your important work in Myanmar, of course. Before we do so, however, on the conceptual issue, I mean, typically these repressive acts that you would refer to, they would coincide with the human rights violations, massive human rights violations, if you will, and structural human rights violation also, if you will. What, aside from adding perhaps a special stigma to the deed, is the essential difference between state crime and the state human rights violation?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that we did explore. I think one of the things that we need to think about is, with crime, as I said, is a really powerful label. And we could look at the state and look at the whole range of violations. Some people have written about state crime in higher education. Now,
there is a lot of crime happening in higher education, but
well, even sort
rather
of
on the structural level.
Yeah, if you like, the way in which structurally certain groups are if you like, excluded because of poverty, because of social policy, a whole range of social welfare policies. And so you have to look at whether or not, that's why the state organisational goal is important, you have to look at human rights violations coupled with the state organisational goal factor, and you have to make a decision, because crime loses its value as a concept if it's applied across the board. If we said that all the harms that government engage in were crimes, then the power of the label of genocide is a little bit diminished, if you see what I mean. That if the kinds of, which I assume you were talking about, certain kinds of violations, if they're really part of the political process and that they are not seen as illegitimate by civil society groups, though of course there will be groups that say structurally capitalism is itself a crime, and that's another argument to be had. But for our purposes, crime has a particular valency that I think we wanted to hang on to make it a more, powerful tool. Because if you, I remember interviewing people in a range of countries, but particularly in Turkey, and when you ask the question, not so much in Turkey actually, the Turks were actually more politically very politically astute on this question. But you might say in Myanmar, and you talk about state crime, and they weren't sure what it meant. You know, was the government engaging in crimes? But crime has a very, even in particularly in our societies, we don't associate crime as a label with governments and with corporations necessarily. We automatically think of street crime. We think of shoplifting. We think of basic forms of theft and street violence, because that's the way in which the dominant ideology operates. We think downwards, we don't think upwards in terms of violations. So I think that we do have to look at and distinguish. There's a group of criminologists, and I admire them very much, who work on social harm. They call it xeniology. But they would have a much broader, if you like, sphere of concern than those working explicitly on state crime. And I think the kinds of things that you might have been alluding to in terms of the kind of economic decisions that governments make that induce mass social harm might be better to be understood as a form of what they call social harm rather than crime itself.
Okay. The Austrian political theorist Georg Jelinek, he once quipped that criminal law, that is basically the ethical minimum in any given society. Is that something that you can relate to for your understanding of crimes proper? Is it violating and consistently doing so, structurally maybe doing so, the ethical minimum that would add cohesion to a moral community?
The ethical minimum. I think when it comes to states, the bar is set very low in terms of ethical minimums. And I think that the application of the criminal label can help us lift that bar a bit. I think that we have to work hard, because we have to work hard against dominant perceptions of what crime is, to think of states as committing crimes. And so I think that the ethical minimum is a very loose and vague conception. I'm not sure.
That's what it takes to make a great quote.
Yes.
Very loose conception of everything, basically.
Yep, that's true.
Yeah. Broadly applicable.
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you said your take is basically, and that much I learned already. It is a criminological take, basically, not a legalistic, as you put it, or let's say a normative, if you will. How does it relate to, let's say, international criminal law?
I think with international criminal law, I mean, that's one of the frustrations, I think. I mean, that international criminal law has no teeth, we know that. I mean, it has no enforcement powers. And I'm not suggesting that it should have, actually, because we know that the way in which state structures deploy their enforcement powers. But let's take the case of genocide, which I am particularly interested in. The wheels of international law move incredibly slowly. We have a very sort of broad definition of genocide, which it seems to me was very, very easily applied. If you use the Genocide Convention, it's very easily and readily applied to the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar. But international lawyers would debate that, governments debate it. They were very unwilling for purely political reasons, not legal reasons, to accept the definition of genocide for the Rohingya. Because if you accept the definition of genocide, if you say, okay, yes, this meets this activity, what the Myanmar state is doing to the Rohingya is clearly genocide. Once a state acknowledges that, or an international court, or the United Nations as a supranational body, then it's required, it's obligated to act. It's obligated to act to intervene, to prevent that act, and intervene to punish perpetrators. And we know that states are incredibly reluctant to do that, to commit, to make that determination because of the obligations. which will run against international trade interests, which will run against all sorts of political interests, international political interests. So international law, there are conventions, and it's not that they're not useful, and they can be used symbolically, but I have very little faith in the International Criminal Court, for example, or the ICJ. The Gambia, you may know, brought a case against the Myanmar state on grounds of genocide. The initial determination of the ICJ was simply that Myanmar should abide by as a signatory, should abide by the Genocide Convention. It should have been abiding by the Genocide Convention anyway, if you believe that laws have that degree of power. And I think with states they don't. So international law, it's not that we will be necessarily very distant in terms of our definition of what a crime is always, but we have a much more, if you like, I think it's much more sophisticated, much more penetrating understanding of crimes committed by states. And it's a much more, if you like, flexible way, or a reflective way of looking at state actions and determining whether or not a crime has been committed. It's also what I like about our definition, and of course I like our definition, it's our definition, but...
You may be a bit biased.
I may be a bit biased, but what I think is valuable about it, it also conceptualizes state criminality as a process. And the law can't do that. The law thinks in terms of discrete events, discrete phenomena. So for genocide, the law has an understanding of genocide as some kind of spectacularized violent event in which thousands of people are killed. That's the way in which the law conceptualizes genocide. It's an event, but we know that genocide, and in fact, Raphael Lemkin, who talked about genocide for the first time and was one of the key architects of the Genocide Convention, and wasn't particularly happy with the convention when it was done. But he understood it as a process. You can't, even state agents can't kill indiscriminately. It's hard to kill. When you've been socialized not to harm others, when you've been socialized not to kill, it's hard. It's a Rubicon you have to cross. And so state crimes, particularly crimes like torture and genocide, take place over many years, often decades. And it begins with practices of stigmatization and somehow dehumanizing a particular target group within the community. This was certainly true of the Rohingya. And once you dehumanize a group, it becomes easier to perpetrate violence against them or to stigmatize them in ways that exclude them from one's sense of moral obligation. And so that's part of the process. And I think genocide's a really good example because the theorist Daniel Fierstein and a number of others, and we've contributed to this, but to understand one particular form of state crime, genocide as a process, it is helpful to think about the stages of genocide because it allows us to say, hang on, look at what's happening over here. This is genocide in the making, and if you can intervene now, you could stop the worst happening, which is actually what my team and I tried to do when Boris Johnson was the Foreign Secretary in the UK. We were in Myanmar in 2012, 2013. We were doing research. We had heard about a group, the Rohingya, in the far west of the country, in quite a remote part of the country, who were being subjected to all kinds of violence and stigmatization and exclusive practices. So we voiced our concerns. We applied for a grant. We went back and did some research. We wrote to Boris Johnson and we said, we've done this research. Oh no, we wrote, first of all, to an MP, Hugo Swire, part of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and said, we think that there's genocide happening against the Rohingya. And Myanmar, Burma is an important country for the UK in terms of its colonial past. And he wrote back and said, well, it's, we need an evidence base, we need a research evidence base. And we said, okay, we're doing the research. We did the research. we wrote a report. We submitted that report to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and specifically wrote to Boris Johnson. And the reply came back from his office, well, it's not a genocide until a court of law determines it's a genocide. So there's a very good reason not to engage with the legal process. There's a very good reason to work with civil society organisations who might have more success in exposing and defining and challenging these kinds of crimes. And so when we were there initially, what we observed was a whole range of stigmatising processes, dehumanising processes. There was a big hate campaign supported by the government, initiated by a group of ultra-nationalist monks. The monks played a very central role, the Buddhist monks. Don't imagine Buddhist monks are paragons of peacefulness. The Buddhist monks led a vicious campaign against the Rohingya, who you may be aware, are you aware of the Rohingya? I may have, yeah, so it's a Muslim group, who described them as, in the ways that the Nazis described the Jews. This is the way in which the campaign, a government-supported campaign in Myanmar described the Rohingya. And once that stigmatisation took place, as I said, it was easy to begin to commit violence without repercussion against Rohingya groups. And so in 2012, there was an attack on Sittwe, which is the capital of Rakhine State, where the Rohingya live. And about 200 people were killed, and their homes were burnt. So virtually all of the Rohingya of Sittwe, the capital, were driven out of their homes and, if you like, siphoned into a particular area, which then became a camp complex. And there was one remaining ghetto inside Sittwe, which now has 7 military checkpoints, and the Rohingya sort of living what Agamben would call bare lives inside this ghetto. The camps, the Rohingya camps now that have developed and been supported by the UNHCR to some extent, are the most squalid, horrifying places you can imagine, so deeply depressing. But what happened as a result of that violence, which the Rakhine, who are the dominant ethnic group in Rakhine State, supported by state government, initiated the violence. Once this violence took place, the Rohingya were then isolated. So they became isolated into camps, and they became isolated into a heavily policed ghetto and into a few villages, from which, if you like, the Rohingya were too frightened to leave, because they look slightly, on the whole, not always, but slightly different to the Buddhist Burmese. And so, for their own protection, they stayed, they stayed inside the ghetto, but they couldn't get out as well. I mean, that's the other part of the equation. So once you have stigmatisation, sporadic violence, then you have isolation into ghettos and camps. And when you're in that level of isolation, once you're in a camp, once you're in a ghetto, it's much, much easier to systematically weaken you as a target group. So you can deprive the group of food, you can deprive the group of options for livelihood, for engaging in meaningful work. You can deprive the children of that group an education. The Rohingya were denied access to Sittwe University after 2012. They couldn't go to university. There were no schools in the camps, no opportunities to earn a living, reliant on World Food Programme food handouts. And while we were in Myanmar, the World Food Programme cut the calorific intake of food that was going into the camps. You can also deny the group access to healthcare, which was happening. So this was a very severely weakened group. And once you have a severely weakened group, it's much easier to commit mass violence against them, and that's what we saw in 2016 and 17 in Myanmar. You saw the Myanmar military mounting what they called military operations, and 800,000 people were forced to flee. We estimate around 20,000 Rohingya were killed, and normally within law, that's, you know, the incident of mass violence is it. That's the genocide, not what preceded it and not what comes after. But what comes after is hugely important in terms of understanding genocide, because what comes after is a sort of social reorganisation of the society, of the victor society, if you like. And so in Myanmar, and we've got lots of satellite footage of this and on the ground reports from Rohingya who still remain. There are some Rohingya still inside Rakhine State. And what we have learnt is that where a Rohingya village was destroyed, and they destroyed in 2017 353 Rohingya villages, that those villages will be completely razed to the ground. Maybe a Buddhist temple will be built on that site, or a security establishment. In very much the same way as the Israeli state has built forests on top of former Palestinian villages, and it's a standard practice. But it's about, if you like, airbrushing the victim group from the society. And in fact, it's very interesting that Israel has been assisting Myanmar in rewriting the history books to effectively rewrite the Rohingya and the Muslim community out of Myanmar history. So that's another stage in the genocidal process. And the next piece of research I'm looking to do is to examine the role of the humanitarian camp, because in 2017, just a few weeks after these people were still actually fleeing Myanmar, when my team and I went back, well, we went to Bangladesh because we're no longer allowed into Myanmar. And it was in that period that we observed what was happening in the camps, and we talked to a lot of humanitarians and we had talked to them in Myanmar, who from their perspective had crossed all sorts of red lines from their perspective. No, we won't work in these camps if they become, you know, more permanent structures, or we won't work with in these camps if we are dictated to by the Myanmar government. But ultimately, humanitarians depend on states in order to exist in particular states. So they would say, well, we can't engage in our humanitarian mission if we don't cooperate with Aung San Suu Kyi and her genocidal state, which compromises them tremendously. And in fact, one needs to question exactly what they are doing and what kind of effect they are having in humanitarian terms. But I'm interested in the humanitarian camps in Bangladesh, because it seems to me from our last trip to Bangladesh and reports from Médecins Sans Frontières, who we work with, that the camps are imploding in many respects, and what we are seeing is a replication of many of the stages of genocide in the camp. The stigmatization still occurs, that they're surrounded by barbed wire, they can't mix freely with the Bangladeshi community, so they're very isolated. So in fact, their identity is still being eroded, because that's what genocide is all about, the denial of identity, the erosion of identity. So I suppose in a nutshell, that's a processual understanding of state crime. And I think that's the value of the kind of definition that we operate within, which a legal definition doesn't allow for.
I have a multitude of questions, of course, because this is a fascinating, even if very disturbing account that you're giving here. I would like to emphasize, however, that the audience is welcome to join the conversation at any time. So simply raise your hands and jump in at any point you deem fit, and we will make you part of this conversation. As long as you don't, oh, there's a question in the last row here. Would you please use the microphone, because otherwise the audience back home in front of the screens can't hear you.
I just want to say that I was in Bangladesh too, in Cox's Bazar, Utreya, with Medicine Sans Frontières, and I worked in the camp for 9 months. And I saw how the situation with the Rohingyas was, and I saw the traumatized people and all these things. And I can understand what you're talking about very directly. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, well, you will. And I think you made the really important point that the camp, it's vast. I mean, you know, I think we've got 1.2 million Rohingya across the camp complex in Cox's Bazar. And this is a city, effectively, but it's a city based on trauma, as you said. And I mean, it was very interesting to me, because when we first went, and I don't know when you were there, but when we went in, it was August that the military operations took place, and then we were there in September, late September, and people were still arriving, and there was a sort of an energy in the camp, despite the fact that people were deeply, deeply traumatized. You know, many people had witnessed family members being murdered in front of them. You know, some of the stories are so horrific, I won't mention them, but that everybody in that camp was traumatized in one way or another. But they had to survive, and they were building their shelters, and they had to build the shelters themselves. They were provided with certain, they either had to pay for the bamboo or the tarpaulin, and they were given the other. But they were building their shelters, and they were trying to put together schools and marketplaces. They were trying to build a life despite the nature of their deep trauma. But from what I'm hearing much more recently is that organised criminal gangs, of course, are exploiting the camps, trafficking of women and children and drugs. Inevitable in a situation like this, absolutely inevitable. And one of the most disturbing things is that we're finding that civil society leaders are being murdered by some of these organised criminal organisations. And that is dreadful in terms of, you know, thinking about the future of the Rohingya. So I think that the camps are really an interesting phenomena, the humanitarian camp, and it's not just the camps in Bangladesh, but there's a long history of problematic humanitarian camps, and the humanitarian mission is complex. And actually, Médecins Sans Frontières are the most interesting of all of the humanitarian organisations that we interviewed, particularly in Myanmar, because they're the most self-reflective and could see the dangers of their role in the process. But I was very struck by humanitarians who would basically do, and I'm not talking about the ordinary people on the ground who are trying to deliver aid, but those who run these organisations, what they will do to stay in country. You know, they're prepared to sell their soul, basically. And none of them would put their head, apart from MSF, who did put their head above the parapet to call it a genocide. Well, they didn't call it a genocide. They talked about massacres that were taking place in northern Rakhine State, and that was enough for them to be expelled from Rakhine State by the Myanmar government, the government of Aung San Suu Kyi, I should point out.
But that only would add to your disturbing account, because, I mean, to my naive mind, I always had the image of a humanitarian camp as some kind of a sanctuary, a place of refuge. And the picture that the two of you basically now paint for us here in the audience is quite a different one.
Yeah, and I'm not, you know, I would be very careful not to undermine the motives of many humanitarians who are doing a fantastic job in terms of delivering healthcare and attempting to support those communities. But these camps, you know, their very existence does seem to be replicating many of the stages of genocide that we witnessed inside Myanmar. Now, it's research that has to be done. I mean, I'm hoping to do it, and when I step down as dean. But I think it's...
We all hope to do some research as soon as we step down as deans.
But I do think it's important, and we have to challenge this idea of humanitarian camps as being holy sanctuaries, holy places of safety and security, because they actually aren't.
Well, let's focus on that research. If a guy in a pinstripe suit like me talks about research, it's the image of me complacently sitting in my office and reading a book and reading another and making a third book out of the two that I read. So that's basically research, according to my understanding. Your research on site, your field work seems to be rather different from what I'm doing. What does Penny Green do in places such as Bangladesh, for example? What do you and your team actually do?
Well, I do read. I have to say, I do read. I preface this, and before any field work, of course, we read intensively and extensively about a country and know very well. But we also build networks, and we also use our civil society contacts and so on. So we go normally on a tourist visa because we will never get permission, government permission to go in. So, you know, we go in on tourist visas.
So you're entering the country illegally in order to research illegality?
Quite possibly.
Okay.
But needs must. And so we, you know, in this kind of work you need a fixer, you need fixers, you need translators, you need a team, because this is not the sort of work that you should ever do on your own. And I had a team, there were 3 of us. And I had, my researchers stayed in the field longer than me, because they were postdocs and had the time. And so what we do is you know, this snowballing effect, you talk to one person, you have a structure. So, you know, you decide actually what we want to do. And we had previously, before we went, we had some excellent contacts, particularly with a photographer, Greg Constantine, who has filmed the Rohingya for about 15 years. And he had filmed the Rohingya really early on. So his was a sort of a documentary, a visual record of genocide in the making. And we talked to Greg a lot, and obviously he gave us some of his contacts. We built our own when we were in country. Then our view was that we needed to understand what was happening. How were the Rakhine ethnic group involved? To what extent were they completely separate from the Rohingya? What role did the local state play in relation to the national state, the federal state? What role did humanitarians play? So what role did business play? So we interviewed a very wide, about almost 200 people on this particular field trip visit, where we really identified a genocide. And it was, so you're out and about, you stay in less than comfortable accommodation, you have to get into places that you wouldn't normally have access to, so you need a fixer who has access, who can get you into camps, who knows when there won't be police officers on the gates of the camps, or who may have some arrangement, and to get into the ghetto. So you need a good fixer. You need somebody who can get you into these places. You act quite quickly when you're in there, in case, you know, on several occasions we heard that the police were coming or had heard about us, so we wind up quickly and move on. But it is about having a series of questions that answers we wanted to find out about. We wanted to find out about what the experience of the Rohingya had been like historically, how long families had been how they could trace their ancestry, because that's one of the things the Myanmar government was describing the Rohingya as part of the stigmatization process as illegal Bengali immigrants. And so what the Rohingya were at pains to do every time we met Rohingya groups, in their little huts or in the horrible, horrible confines of the camps, they would go behind a little curtain and they'd bring out, in a little plastic wallet, they would bring out identity documents, the identity documents of their grandparents, of their fathers. Some people showed us that their parents or grandparents had been members of the Myanmar parliament, or that they had been police officers, or they had been civil servants. They wanted to show us the sort of the history, the thread that their group, their ethnic group, had in the country, that they were Myanmaris, they were Myanmar Rohingya. They didn't belong anywhere else. Myanmar was their home. So that kind of evidence was really important to us, and we gathered that. We conducted interviews. We tried to interview as many women as we could too, because the Rohingya are a deeply conservative, socially conservative group, but we wanted to hear the voices of women, and we found that the conditions, it was probably easier for us to speak to women in these conditions and in the Bangladesh camps because of the trauma that had been experienced, because everybody had a voice and it was really important for them to tell their story. Whereas if in those traditional communities, it would have been only the men that we could have spoken to historically. We were very keen to speak to. You identify the kind of people who are going to have knowledge. So there's not a written language for the Rohingya. It's an oral language, and so we don't have those written records from that group. But there are people who have the history, the narratives, and they will be the village administrators, the imams, the school teachers. So they were key people to interview. So we also interviewed members of very right-wing, ultra-nationalist political parties inside Myanmar who talked about wanting to see all the Rohingya in concentration camps, and then they'd say, whoops, we don't really mean concentration camps, we mean detention camps. There was a lot of Nazi memorabilia in Rakhine, in Sittwe. It was quite interesting. You would see SS helmets, we would see in little bookstores, the Rakhine bookstores, you would see Mein Kampf. It was quite interesting. So we were, if you like, observers, we were interviewers, we were trying to understand from as many different triangulated areas as possible what was going on.
And at the same time, it seems to be more than just that. I mean, isn't it also about raising awareness? Isn't it also about blowing the whistle to some extent? Isn't it also
definitely
on the crossroads of scholarship and activism, if you will?
Oh yes, when we came back, definitely. Not while we were there. Apart from when we were talking to the Rohingya. I mean, clearly, when you're talking to a group that has been treated in this manner, who have suffered so many violations, in order for them to tell their story, they need to have some sense that you are identifying, you understand, that you are appreciative, that you're on their side. And, you know, Howard Becker, the great American sociologist, wrote a wonderful paper called "Whose Side Are You On?" And I think it's incumbent on us, those of us who are doing this kind of research, to actually, you know, be very explicit about whose side we're on. Of course, when I'm interviewing the Attorney General for Rakhine State, and I'm interviewing far right-wing politicians, we're not going to adopt that. We'll be then the neutral researcher. But I think certainly once this data is gathered and we analyse it and make sense of it, we work very closely with Rohingya groups in the UK, and we do a lot of public speaking, and we advocate. We make we have given all of our data for what good it will do, but to the ICC mechanism who are investigating the genocide. We have given our data to the lawyers representing the Gambia and the ICJ. I have absolutely no faith that these institutions will do anything at all. But the Rohingya put some faith in them, and for the Rohingya too, and for activists, it is a symbolic device. It's a tool in the toolbox. You can use it. If the ICG is about to make a determination, it's an opportunity to get active, to start, really advocating hard. So there are things that we do, and a boycott campaign, which one of the big NGOs in the UK has organised, I think is one way forward if we're talking about what kind of advocacy, what kind of activism, sanctions, boycotts, divesting from Myanmar. These are strategies that the civil society engages in, but that's part of the activism, and it is. But you can't, for us as scholars, it's really important to do the scholarship first, to develop the research base, to know what we're talking about, to have it as bulletproof as possible so that activists can use it, so that our reports are seen as incredibly reliable, and that's really important. So we have to get our scholarship right.
Final question, maybe, because you indicated before, well, part of the deal necessarily is to sleep in less than comfortable accommodations, you put it, okay, that may be something that armchair researchers such as I aren't used to, but at the same time, I mean, this seems to be a very dangerous endeavor, at least at some point, because what you do tends to be more than just a nuisance to local authorities. So when's the point for you to say, well, this is simply too much, this is simply putting the life of myself or my team on the line, maybe even, because this is a highly dangerous environment to be working in, evidently.
It would be much more dangerous now, in the sense that the military are now. I mean, and we are, I think, banned from Myanmar. None of us would be able to enter Myanmar now safely. I think we make these assessments, and when you're there, it is less dangerous than it seems. I think that there are always risks, probably as much sort of falling off one of the motorbikes we had to take across paddy fields in order to get to isolated villages or camps. We're connected, we take precautions, we have developed protocols so that when I was out of the country and my two researchers were in, every time they took a plane, they would have to WhatsApp me. Or now we use Signal because it's more secure. We took all sorts of precautions, and when they landed, they would again send me a message. We had everything. Once an interview was recorded, they would send it back to the UK in a particular file and have an iron key, and then they would delete it from their computers. So we have to, there are precautions that we take, and some places are more dangerous than others. We were followed. But we knew that we might be followed, but at that stage, because it was the early days, and it was a sort of a democratic process in transition when we were there. It was though a very, very flawed democratic transition, and Aung San Suu Kyi was absolutely central to the genocide. It wasn't simply the military. But we were connected, and you have to make these judgments. And we had to go through our own ethics committee, of course, at the university, and they found it very difficult. We had to go to the ethics committee 3 times because the medics and the mathematicians on the ethics committee couldn't quite get their head around what we were doing, but we persisted. And I think this work is possible, but you do have to be sensible. I mean, there was no. We don't take unnecessary risks.
Well, that is finally a relief to hear, because your work is as admirable as it is important, and of course our best wishes accompany you for following up on it and your future research. Thank you so much, Penny, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. Very much, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, for being with us tonight, either on site or on screen. This was the last Dean's Talk this term. We will reconvene not in the University of Graz pop-up store, but on site at the Zoli building on the campus in autumn, where we will welcome another round of very interesting guests. But for now, I wish all of you a wonderful summer. It is indeed, I think, well-deserved to take a break from all the activities. I think many of us have over the last couple of months, and maybe also a break from everything else that has been going on over the last couple of weeks and months. So I'm very much looking forward to welcoming as many of you as possible on site in autumn, and until then, I hope that you will spend a quite enjoyable time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.